Well, I'm delighted to say joining us today, Jonathan Gibson, political commentator, and also Sophia Worringer, who is also a political commentator. Good morning to the two of you.
Good morning, David.
Are you fine and fit?
Absolutely excited to be here.
Oh, bless you. Now, really interesting, of course, there's a lot going on politically, and this story this morning, which is in the Telegraph, Rishi Sunak, I just wonder whether the worm is finally turning here, because Rishi Sunak says he will face down the government's climate advisers over demands for ministers to halt the expansion of airports. This may well be a very significant move indeed. Apparently, there is a shift in the Prime Minister's approach to net zero. He's going to move from, yes, we must do it immediately, to something of a more proportionate and pragmatic way. And the government allegedly is going to reject the Climate Changes Committee's formal advice that all airport expansions must be halted. And of course this comes on the back of Claire Cortino being put into position. He's one of her she is one of his closest allies. There is also a massive backlash going on amongst the Conservative members of Parliament about this net zero. I keep saying we should have a referendum on net zero. Where do you stand on this, Sophia?
I do think he needs to be cautious about this. I think the by-elections have shown that voters are really concerned about the cost it's going to be to them. And I think the airport expansion is interesting because if we halt our airport expansion in 15 years, when we have sustainable aviation fuels flying our planes around the world, we'll be left behind where other countries are extending their airports. Real wages are stagnating. We know we need growth. We know we need more imports coming in. We know we need more trade deals. And expanding the airports is the right decision, and because the technology will catch up and we'll be able to do that in a green and sustainable way.
I mean, absolutely. Just in terms of where we are in airports, we talked about this with the air traffic control disaster last week. The fact is that we don't have enough airport capacity in this country. I was just reading this morning, London's Gatwick City and Heathrow airports all want to expand. And of course, whilst we don't do anything, around the world, new international airports are being built in cities like Mumbai, also Dubai and Sydney. Jonathan, where do you sit on this?
So I do support building new airports. I do support increasing our capacity. Then we have to realise that net zero is actually quite a popular policy. You know, a lot of polls.
Says who?
Yes, there was a recent YouGov poll which said that 60% of people support net zero.
Did you look at the questions? I wonder.
Yeah,
they don't support it when it costs them, though.
No, they don't. They don't support it. For example, in the context of ULIS with South Ruislip, where we saw, you know, when it has a really tangible, hard-hitting impact on them at a cost of living crisis time, they don't like it then. And I can completely understand that and completely, you know, resonate with that. But at the same time, people still do care about climate change. People do still care about global warming. And so it's sort of this balancing game between, you know, making sure there's not really heavy costs that are imposed on them at a really difficult time. But then also at the same time, people do want to see, you know, climate policies changing and us adapting to make sure that we can live in a sustainable world that has a future. So whilst, you know, we do need to for sure be careful, and I do want to expand airports, we also should provide incentives for airports to, you know, use renewable aviation fuel. And I think that's important. That can create jobs and that can create opportunities as well in the future.
And Renée's point's a really good one. What was the question that was asked of those people?
It was, as far as what I read, was do you support net zero?
Exactly.
In what time frame?
The government's targets.
So which is either 2050 or 2030. I'm not sure the public is that supportive, actually, Sophia.
I really don't think they are. I think it's very well for people who kind of live fairly comfortable lives to legislate on net zero when they know they can probably spare the extra cash to pay for the ULEZ or pay for the other things. But those whose real wages have stagnated, everyone's feeling the pinch. But, you know, the most disadvantaged, the poorest in our communities, they don't have the extra cash to spend on it, and they're frankly not focused on that. Whether that's right or wrong is a different question, but they don't want it. They want to put food on the table, they want to get their wages increased, they want to see their kids in good schools. That's what's most important.
Right, absolutely. And when you look at the Climate Change Committee, what they've actually said, and this is chaired by Lord Debon and John Cummer, it recommends that expansion would facilitate increased aviation. In practice, this means actually shutting down the equivalent of Stansted Airport in order to accommodate the proposed Gatwick expansion of its capacity from 46 million users to 75 million. So essentially, to achieve net zero, we're going to have to close airports. Yeah. That's absolutely ludicrous, isn't it?
No, we definitely need to be careful with our timing, and we need to be careful with the way that we're doing things. You know, there are particular measures which do disproportionately impact poorer people, and we need to look at how we can distribute it in a way that's fair to everyone. I don't think anyone's saying, and at least I would not support, you know, net zero, which purely comes on the back of people who are lower income. Unfortunately, generally with policies around, fuel, it will hit lower income people more, and there's almost very little that you can do about that. But at the same time, we still need to support, these aims and these goals.
Why do we? Because we're making the poorest people in society suffer. That's wrong.
Yes, but by facilitating lots of climate change, we're also making the poorest people.
We're not.
Yes, we are. There's 3,000 people, for example, of air pollution deaths a year, and that's
absolutely nonsense. Sadiq Khan comes out with this nonsense the whole time.
It's nonsense.
So the
individuals that have
the original report was in the Lancet. It said nothing like that, and basically Sadiq Khan lent on the deputy mayor. The deputy mayor lent on the scientists, and what they published was absolute nonsense.
No, and also this 4,000, it's actually 4,000 deaths a year from air pollution is a model. That's not the number of people that are dying from air pollution. And actually, if you dig down into the data, there are people whose deaths may be hastened by air quality in London by how many days? 3. 3 days.
That's not the reports that I read, and that's not the science that I read. I mean,
it is the science. And
okay, well, that's not what I understood from the
evidence.
evidence.
This trope keeps getting muttered out there by everyone. Everyone keeps on saying and repeating it, and it's not true.
But then why is there such
lie.
a clear correlation between the areas which have the worst air quality and numbers of deaths from things like lung
but there are lots of things
disorders.
to contribute to breathing disorders.
Yes, but
poverty, diet, housing, mould, treatment, access to healthcare.
Of course, there's other correlations, but this is one that's very, very clear, and there's one which is a scientific explanation for.
Renée, stop picking on him.
But it's not clear.
I understand, but also let me just ask you this very quickly, and I'll come to Sophia. If everyone is so excited about net zero, why did we see the result in Uxbridge?
Because that was something that was, firstly, a particularly tough time for many individuals with the cost of living crisis caused by
as it will
inflation.
be for the election next year.
Well, firstly, things are dramatically improving, actually. Things are really, inflation is falling, interest rates are falling. We are in a much better situation than we were about a year ago. But so that's one reason. And also that's because, that's a policy which does disproportionately impact poorer people. This airport expansion is not going to, for example, impact poor people in quite the same way as the ULEZ stuff, which, people will be seeing the tangible impact.
Well, that's right, Sophia. We've been talking about nurses, for example, going to hospitals to do night shifts. You get hit twice. So on both days, when you're going to work, when you're coming back from work, there is a real backlash to what is going on. Sadiq Khan, we spoke about this yesterday. People are vandalising the cameras. He's now popped up mobile vans. I don't understand still to this day how paying a fee actually improves the environment. That makes no sense to me whatsoever. Are we seeing a different Conservative Party here? Because Claire Cortino's come in. I think she's sceptical about net zero. I think this could be a seismic moment. Let's just say the Conservative Party does pivot and say, actually, we're deeply nervous about the pace of change, even though it's enshrined in law. Would that then give clear blue water? Because it would then force Starmer to have a position, which actually I don't think has a position on anything.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. But I think that the timing and the phasing of this is so important, because we actually have a potential to make net zero be a launch pad for productivity, for new green skills jobs, for being a leader in this kind of very innovative area. And if we slightly slow the pace, it allows for us to invest in those areas where we can really see huge boosts to GDP. And I think we've talked about like hydrogen as a power. There's things coming along. We just need a little bit more time to bring them on, but in a way that brings people with them. It brings jobs, it brings investment into areas. I think that's what's needed. And I do think the Conservatives are maybe waking up to this. I know the new, the Energy Secretary, she will be conscious of the effect on the most disadvantaged, for example. And I think there is time to create some distance between them and Labour while still being aware of our climate obligations, which are important, but doing it in a pace of change where people can move with it.
So it's really interesting. I'm starting to see changes being announced. For example, suddenly they seem to have woken up and realised that actually there are 4.4 million people in rural communities who need oil. Now, until yesterday, I don't think they realised they existed. And so, again, we're starting to see a pivot. One other pivotal thing that I think will happen is Rishi Sunak is facing a major Tory split over our membership of the ECHR. So excuse me. So obviously, as we know, the migrant crisis is going to be again a really important factor in the next election. The question is, what happens now? So if Rwanda is blocked yet again, as we know, it was blocked by the pyjama injunction, the 11th hour injunction. I love the term pyjama injunction, but it was blocked. Now, lots of grassroots Tories are so worried about their seats, aren't they? And the question is now, if we are told you cannot actually deport people to Rwanda yet again, is it time to leave the ECHR?
No, absolutely not, and I don't think it will happen. But you know, there's several reasons for this why I absolutely don't think it should happen. Firstly, we're joining ranks with countries like Belarus, Russia, who are the only countries that have left. It's contingent on our UK-EU trade relations agreement for services that we and goods that we both support the EHRC and that we stay in them, and both for international law and security is very important. We're not going to be able to cooperate with them according to the clause if we leave the ECHR. And you know, it's not correct. We're basically blaming our own failure of our immigration policy on Europe, you know, which is not the case.
Are Australia and America in the ECHR?
No, but this is a European.
But you said that we're going to be like Belarus and Russia.
No, but in the European
I understand
context,
that.
In the European context,
but other countries function perfectly well without being part of it.
Yes, but that's because they're not part. They don't have the same sort of. This was developed by Winston Churchill to sort of the platform of Europe.
So we are part of the
relations.
ECHR. We're not part of the European Union, and they are different. You're right.
No, we still have relations with Europe.
So we do, but the question is, if we can't do, as a sovereign democratic country, if we can't do what we want to do, and they have passed the illegal migration bill, and you've got some dude over there, over the channel, telling you, actually, you can't enact what you have put through the House of Commons and the House of Lords, isn't it time to say, guess what, we don't want to play with you anymore?
Well, this is the whole purpose of it was designed to prevent, for example, from authoritarian governments or people who are overreaching, breaking human rights laws. So, you know, someone in Turkey can't just be put in prison, or it can be challenged by the European Human Rights Committee for that very purpose. And so I think it's really important that we have these standards. It's important for international cooperation. It's important to ensure that we have solid standards when it comes to human rights. And I think it's a really important and really positive.
Can't we have human rights without signing up to the ECHR?
We can, but this isn't a very important check for it. You know, this is a very, very important check to ensure.
But you see,
that
I believe in Britain. I believe that we can actually have our own standards.
And what's going to ensure that we necessarily follow them?
Our own standards, Sophia.
So what ensures that America or Australia follow their own?
They have other agreements within.
So what's stopping us?
And they're often not, you know, and there are violations. We saw, you know, America frequently violating human rights.
So you don't trust us to behave?
It's not about trusting us to behave, it's about ensuring that we have an international standards that we can use to cooperate with other countries on law enforcement, on security, and we have a check on our own power, because I think it's really important.
How would we keep ourselves in check, Sophia?
People get very squeamish about saying we're going to leave the European Convention on Human Rights because they think we're leaving human rights behind. Obviously, we're not going to do that. We're absolutely not going to do that. And it's stupid to remove your kind of trump card from the negotiation. You need to include the ability to remove yourself from the ECHR as a way of strengthening your negotiation in this whole process. People really care about illegal migration. It needs to be stopped. Everyone agrees with that. It's dangerous and it's exploitative, the people crossing on the channel. We need to include every weapon in our arsenal to be able to deal with this very serious, very dangerous problem.
OK, let's just move on very quickly indeed. We've also got, I think the next election is going to be absolutely fascinating, and of course there's a lot of talk about that. Up in Scotland, Hamza Yousaf is now, has told a pro-independence rally that the Yes movement, they can help correct the damages of Brexit. He says the way forward is for them, guess what, to rejoin the European Union. So he went on to describe Brexit as a national tragedy. So you've obviously got all these really interesting factions moving around. The Conservatives pivoting, I think, in terms of net zero. Also, Rishi Sunak has this list of 5 pledges. The question is, can he actually meet them? Meanwhile, I'm still not sure what Keir Starmer stands for. The Sun today, the Sun newspaper, is saying, and I agree wholeheartedly with this, our very mixed poll shows the Prime Minister must come out all guns blazing before the next election. 40% of voters think he has made zero progress on his 5 priorities. And for a Tory Prime Minister to be less trusted on law and order than a Labour leader will be particularly hard to stomach, especially given Sir Keir Starmer's checkered record in charge of the CPS. They basically said he needs to come out all guns blazing. Can Rishi Sunak turn this round?
I mean, you never know what's going to happen, but definitely if I was a betting man, I would not hedge my money on Keir Starmer. I mean, you know...
On Keir Starmer?
Sorry, on Rishi Sunak.
I was going to say,
No, I would absolutely hedge my money on Keir Starmer.
So that's interesting. You think it's a slam dunk for Labour?
You can never say for certain, because something could dramatically change, but at the moment it's...
How much would you wager?
I'd say 80-20 that...
no, how much money?
Oh, I'm not a betting man myself, so I don't think I would... and I've got a student loan,
Oh, right, so
I need to be
not-
responsible at the moment.
You do, very good
But,
job.
you know.
And Sophia?
I think the path to victory for the Conservatives is still there. People really don't know what Keir stands for, and I appreciate he will be wanting to put out more concrete policies in the next year. We really need to get to those policies because people don't know what they are, and I appreciate that, you know, the poll that shows that the Labour are more trusted on crime, that is going to really worry number 10. But the economy, and actually that's what people can care about most. If Rishi can deliver on an economy, if people have more money in their pocket, if people feel a bit more able to breathe at the end of each month, that's what's going to drive people to vote one way or other, I think. Yes, crime is important, but I think the economy is the clincher there. And the path is narrow to victory for the Conservatives, but I do think it is there. But Rishi should really lean into the realignment of politics that happened in 2019. You know, the red wall being brought into the Conservative family, branching out the appeal of the Conservative Party. He hasn't fully lent into that. And I think the policies that matter most to those people in those communities, particularly in the north and the northeast, the northwest, where I'm from, is the economy. And I think he should be leaning into that realignment.
So I think that I agree with you that the economy is the number one priority. I think the problem here, though, is that Keir Starmer is doing a much better job than Jeremy Corbyn did of leaning into the red wall as well. You know, on culture issues, he's definitely moving more towards obviously the centre. You can't get much more left wing than Jeremy Corbyn, I guess, but he's definitely, you know, much more moving towards the centre culturally, economically. You know, he said he's not having a wealth tax. He's saying that, you know, he doesn't seem to be supporting the far left MPs in his party at the moment. So I think, you know, he's doing a much better job of covering that sort of centre ground, which, you know, swung Conservative massively in 2019, and the red wall ground as well.
So if you, very quickly, because I have to go to a break, but if you were Rishi Sunak, when would you call the election? Would you wait till October, or would you call it early?
I'd wait, because I don't
Right till October.
I don't think you're going to win either way, but
the economy gets better and better, obviously.
Well, that's the point. Yeah, that is exactly the point.
yeah, exactly.
So wait, Sophia, what would you do? You're advising the Prime Minister now. What are you going to do? Are you going early? Keir Starmer, basically, according to this article this morning, says he believes that he will go early. He will call it in May.
I think he should wait. I think the most time that they can give to the growth of the economy, the most green shoots of recovery people can see. They don't need to see it going all the way, but they need to see the trajectory moving in the right direction.
They won't want it spoiled.
Very interesting. Let's pause for a moment and take a breather. Time for a break. After the break, we'll resume our Future Politics panel. This is TalkTV. Brainwash. Oh, Jonathan, you've got another one here. Kenny in Edinburgh. Hi, Dr. Dave. And Renee, it makes my blood boil when people like Jonathan make it sound like leaving the ECHR will turn us into a country of savages. Get a grip, Jonathan. Stop talking rubbish. The same rules would apply in regards to human rights. It's just that the UK would be in control of what we want to do. Stop making it sound like we can't control ourselves in the UK and the ECHR is the only answer. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, happily. Yeah. So, you're saying the UK is not going to, violate any human rights abuses. Even if you look, 50, 60 years ago, the UK, has been a home for my family for years, but it turned away, for example, people fleeing persecution across the world repeatedly, Even after during the Holocaust, people came in boats to Britain, 83% of them were turned back, okay? These are people fleeing literally for their lives, back to their deaths, What is to stop that from happening again? And we've seen, even recently there was someone that worked for the British in Afghanistan, literally putting their life on the line, and they've just been turned away and they haven't been able to get citizenship. We've seen the absolute mess that we've made in terms of Afghanistan and the evacuation
we're
effort.
in the ECHR, so everything you've just said about the Afghanistan can't get citizenship, the ECHR didn't help.
Yeah, but that's because we've been sort of ignoring
ECHR was
parts
set
of
up
their
after
policies.
the Second World War as well.
No, that's a very valid point, of course.
Yes, no, it is, but my point is not that. My point is that, we need these frameworks, in a sense, to support our efforts. And with the Afghanistan things, that's because we've been ignoring sort of some of the overseas elements of it, which we, of course, can do.
That's
the other option,
that's a very complex issue because, of course, there was a power vacuum because, obviously, we kowtowed to what the Americans wanted to do. Yes, I agree, it was a terrible withdrawal, the whole thing was a complete and utter mess. Do you want to just say something on that?
If we can control our migration, both legal and illegal, we can have more scope and more space to offer visas and citizenship to people like the Afghan interpreters. The problem is we're being so bombarded by people who really don't need the desperate help that they say they do, potentially, not all, but some, and therefore it means we don't have space to offer or capacity to offer to who we actually want to.
So last year 44,000 came in illegally. We've seen the pictures of the boats, predominantly young men, economic migrants. I had a big argument actually on when I was doing Drive about this, about whether you call them migrants, economic migrants, whether you call them asylum seekers. But also, Jonathan, there is a real problem here in terms of providing services, schools, hospitals. If we can't control the numbers coming in, how can we provide services?
I think the problem with that is that we can't build in this country. I don't think that's necessarily because of the numbers. You know, we have far lower migration levels than many other countries across the world. In fact, most countries. Right, but even per space, you know, if you look at countries like Jordan or whatever, countries, you know, who are next to places in which, you know, massive humanitarian crises are occurring per capita, even for the size of them, they're having tons more. And so, you know, the problem is that we can't build, not that we can't provide. We've got lots of space to build.
Well, I agree with you that longer term, that's probably the right thing to think about and do. But right now, on the day that we are here, we can't give our own people born and bred here school places close to where they live, treatment in a speedily and timely way, GP appointments, dentists. We don't have the infrastructure. So with the best will in the world, it's going to take 20 years to get to a point where we do have the infrastructure.
Right, but also to develop that infrastructure, firstly, we need people, in a sense, and also through this migrant crisis that we've created through the massive backlogs, which has nothing to do with the numbers, it's just to do with our own inadequacy in the Home Office.
170,000 still waiting.
That's to do with us. That's not due to the people.
Well, it is due
for someone to wait.
It's the numbers, the lack of resources, the lack of willpower, actually, and government being ineffective. But let's move on. Let's move on and talk about what I've been asking all morning, because I was under the impression, and clearly mistakenly, that this was a free country. And the reason I say this, there are three stories this morning that I saw. First of all, on the back of the whole Coots scandal and Nigel Farage scandal of being debanked, now Richard Tice has been debanked. This is by Quidnet. His company Quidnet basically went to Swiss Re. They basically said you can't have a bank account because you're politically exposed and you're a nasty Brexiteer and you run Reform UK. Secondly, now we're in a state where we also have cameras everywhere. We talked about ULEZ earlier. We've got cameras all over the supermarkets. We've never been so spied on in our lives. Now, the story this morning is staff at Tesco stores will be wearing body cameras amid a rise in violent attacks, according to the supermarket's chief executive. This is because they've seen physical assaults increase by a third. Interestingly, I didn't know this, they've already implemented this in Waitrose and in the Co-op. Also, I know, and this I'm going to broaden into a bigger question about what is happening to this country, because also supermarkets don't want to pay checkout staff, so they've introduced those dreadful self-scan tills, which never work, by the way, and it always says incorrect item in bagging area. And honest shoppers who are using those self-scan things and doing what they think is right are now having their bags checked at supermarkets because of shoplifting. Many supermarkets, Sainsbury's and Morrison's, have introduced gates after the self-scan tills at some of their stores have proved to be losing them money. What's going on?
I mean, first of all, the supermarkets do need to protect their staff, you know, with a body-worn cameras, etc.
Are you happy with that?
It's not nice, but if it's better than them being, you know, punched in the face, it's a temporary measure. I think it should happen. But in the long term,
but
obviously, it's not a nice...
But it's not a temporary measure, is it?
We should be looking to implement things that people are kind of responsibly using these supermarkets. You know, supermarkets have made a huge profit during the pandemic, and yet they're cutting staff and implementing them with these self-scanners. I do think that's a problem, and employers should be thinking about their responsibility, not just always looking at the government to top up wages, looking at government to lots of people who are working in the supermarkets may also be being supported on welfare. You know, they should be looking at how they can improve working conditions, and people like to interact with people. They don't love to interact with machines all the time. So I do think supermarkets need to take a bit of responsibility for what's happened, and it's not nice to have cameras everywhere, but in the short term it might be what's necessary.
I want to say we're the most watched nation per mile. I think that's right.
Maybe after Beijing, yeah.
Well, right. Jonathan, are you happy with the direction of travel?
I don't like surveillance generally, absolutely not. However, I do understand that shoplifting, and from what I've read, shoplifting is a massive problem. It's hitting supermarkets hard, and particularly with the self-checkouts. If you don't have any surveillance or anyone watching, it's quite easy, I'd imagine, to do it.
But does this not come back to, as we've seen with so many things, our laws not being implemented? Because shoplifting is illegal, there's no police around, assaulting someone is illegal.
Yeah, so they clearly, police clearly don't have the ability at the moment, and there was a study in the article about this, to uphold law and order when it comes to shoplifting. They just don't have the time, they don't have the capacity at the moment, which is a problem in and of itself, and we can talk about that. But it means, that the supermarkets themselves are having to take responsibility for that, and this is their solution, and I think it's fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a vigilante society, isn't it? And it all comes back... Well, it feels increasingly like that. I don't want to live in this country if you have cameras where no one trusts each other, where you have a lack of social interaction. I've said it before, it's really important for the elderly.
But you know what it comes back to, don't you? It all comes back to parenting. And it all comes back to teaching our children the rights and wrongs of what they do in the world, how they treat people. What about
desperation and poverty?
I don't think this is about desperation and poverty. I really don't. I think it's about being able to do it now, because there's no police presence. They don't even prosecute anyone who shoplifts under £250. This is about parenting and standards and morals.
I told you that story when I was on the tube and a man opened his coat and out fell all this salmon and steak. I'd never seen anything like it, all still security tags.
Well, talking of trains, you probably have a similar thing when it comes to the ticket barriers. We have to have those turnstiles and things, because at the end of the day, it's all nice saying, we love to trust it, and I would love to trust everyone to, tap their thing, but we need some measures, we need some security enforcement.
We do indeed. So just in terms of where we're going now, just what's your view as a young person involved in politics about younger people and actually how they view the future of this country?
I think they're feeling fairly hopeless in some aspects. Obviously, there'll always be outliers, but people don't feel like they can have a stake in this society. They can't buy a house. It's increasingly becoming difficult to do that. Even renting is becoming impossible in cities like London and Edinburgh. It's what is there for them to gain? There's not much motivation for them to move on. It's difficult to start a family. You can't have wages. You need 2 wages to have a family, and that's difficult for people. Childcare is very expensive, but people don't want to put their kids in full-time childcare all the time. Not everyone does. There's lots of things that make it difficult for young people to feel excited about their future, which is really, really sad. And I think one of the saddest things will be they will just disengage. You think they might get riled up and campaign and go to the ballot box and change things, but actually a lot of people just won't vote, a lot of young people, and that's really tragic, because that has an impact on the rest of their life.
And then you end up with a massive democratic deficit, don't you,
Yeah,
Jonathan?
and that's a statistic that I've been really scared by, actually, is that fewer and fewer young people are engaging in politics, are reading the news, and are just, caring about what's going on, and I think it's a real problem. I think, the property market and everything like that is obviously not providing them much hope. But I think, young people do need to read the news, do need to take...
I do think the one thing that young people had to aspire to was to get their own property.
I agree.
And when you take that away from them, which we have in the main, then they have nothing. What's the point?
It's about aspiration, isn't it? And belief.
The number of awful renting stories that I've heard, you've seen it on social media. It's terrible.
It is. Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you to you, Jonathan, and also you, Sophia.